Let's begin in the early 1500s. England is Catholic, very Catholic. Everyone answers to the Pope, churches are run in Latin, and the religious structure of Europe is basically one giant institution called the Catholic Church. And sitting on the English throne is a man who, at this point in history, is actually considered one of the Pope's biggest fans. Meet Henry VIII. Now Henry, early in his reign, is not the cartoon villain people imagine. He's athletic, charismatic, educated, writes music, hosts massive feasts, and is basically the Renaissance equivalent of a jacked philosophy major who also happens to run a country. In fact, he's so loyal to the Catholic Church that when Martin Luther starts causing trouble in Europe, Henry personally writes a book defending Catholic theology. The Pope is so impressed, he gives Henry a title, Defender of the Faith, which, fun fact, is still written on British coins today. So at this point, everything is normal. Catholic country, Catholic king, Catholic marriage. Henry is married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess. The problem? Henry desperately needs a male heir, and Catherine isn't producing one. They have several pregnancies, but only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Now today, that might not sound like a massive issue, but in the 1500s, a male heir was basically the difference between political stability and national chaos. No son meant rival claimants to the throne, civil war, nobles trying to seize power, so Henry starts to panic. And then things get worse, because Henry falls in love with Anne Boleyn. Anne is intelligent, charismatic, and very importantly, not interested in being Henry's side girlfriend. Anne basically tells the king, no marriage, no deal. Which means Henry now has a problem, because he's already married. So Henry does what any reasonable Renaissance monarch would do. He decides to ask the Pope to cancel his marriage. Not a divorce, technically an annulment, meaning the marriage would be declared invalid from the start. So Henry sends the request to Pope Clement VII, and the Pope refuses. Now, to be fair to the Pope, this isn't just a random decision. Catherine of Aragon happens to be the aunt of Charles V, one of the most powerful men in Europe. And Charles V is not particularly keen on the Pope humiliating his family. So the Pope stalls, delays, sends lawyers, creates committees. Basically the 16th century version of, we'll circle back to this. Years pass. Henry grows increasingly furious. Anne Boleyn grows increasingly impatient. And eventually, Henry arrives at a solution that will permanently change English history. If the Pope won't grant the annulment, then maybe the Pope shouldn't be in charge of the English Church at all. And with that one decision, the foundations of English Christianity begin to crack. Henry's plan is now in motion. If the Pope won't grant the annulment, then the Pope simply won't have authority in England anymore, which sounds bold, dramatic, revolutionary. But there's just one small problem. You can't just declare yourself head of the church and expect everyone to nod politely and move on. Someone has to actually run the country, pass the laws, enforce the rules, and convince people this whole thing isn't completely unhinged. And for years, the man helping Henry do exactly that is his closest advisor and friend, Thomas More. Now, Thomas More is not some random court official. He's one of the most respected scholars in Europe, a brilliant lawyer, a devout Catholic, and a man Henry trusts enough to make Lord Chancellor of England, which is basically the king's right-hand man. These two have known each other for years. They debate philosophy. They joke together. Henry likes to surprise him by showing up, unannounced, at his house for dinner. Picture the King of England just casually appearing at your door like, "Thomas, put the kettle on. Let's talk theology." But now Henry's divorce crisis is turning into something bigger. Because when Henry starts pushing the idea that he, not the Pope, should lead the English Church, Thomas More begins to feel very uncomfortable. Not politically, spiritually. More genuinely believes the authority of the Pope is part of the structure of the Christian Church. You don't just delete it because the king is having a rough marriage. So the tension between the two men begins quietly. Henry keeps pushing the issue. More keeps avoiding it. Eventually, the situation becomes impossible. Henry needs his government to publicly support his new religious authority, which means the most powerful official in England, Thomas More, must back him. Instead, More resigns. He quietly steps down as Lord Chancellor and retreats from public life. Now this is a big deal, because when a man like Thomas More resigns in silence, everyone notices. It's the political equivalent of someone leaving the group chat without saying why. Henry notices too. And Henry doesn't like it, because if More openly opposes him, that could inspire others to resist. So Henry does something clever. He passes a law forcing everyone in government to swear an oath recognizing him as the head of the Church of England. The Act of Supremacy. It's essentially a loyalty test, and everyone knows the real target, Thomas More. So one day, More is summoned and presented with the oath. The officials ask him to sign. Just sign the paper. That's all he has to do. More doesn't make speeches. He doesn't shout. He doesn't accuse the king of heresy. He simply refuses. Calmly, quietly. And that silence becomes the problem, because, legally speaking, refusing the oath counts as treason. So Henry has his former friend arrested. Thomas More is sent to the Tower of London, where he waits for trial. Meanwhile, Henry's revolution keeps moving forward. In 1534, Parliament officially declares that Henry VIII is the supreme head of the Church of England. England now has its own national church. The Pope's authority is gone. The break with Rome is complete. But Thomas More still hasn't signed. Eventually, he's brought to trial. The court pressures him. They argue. They threaten. All he needs to do is admit Henry has authority over the church. But More refuses again. And so the court reaches its conclusion, guilty of treason. In 1535, Thomas More is executed. And with that final act, the message across England becomes unmistakably clear. The king's new church is not optional. The Church of England now answers to the crown, not Rome. And Henry finally gets what he wanted. Freedom from the Pope, freedom to remarry, freedom to shape England's church himself. Of course, the story doesn't end there. Because once Henry removes the Pope from English Christianity, a new question appears that no one has quite figured out yet. If England is no longer Catholic, what exactly is it now? Now here's the funny thing. Henry VIII accidentally detonates the religious equivalent of a nuclear bomb, and then immediately dies before dealing with the fallout. Classic Henry. So now England has no Pope, a brand new church, a king who just executed half the people who disagreed with him, and absolutely no consensus about what the Church of England is supposed to believe. And sitting on the throne is Henry's son. Meet Edward VI. Edward is 9 years old. 9. Which means England is now being run by a child and several extremely enthusiastic Protestant advisors who suddenly realize something very exciting. Wait, we control the national church now? You can practically hear the gears turning. Because if Henry broke away from Rome, Now they could actually rebuild the church however they wanted, so they get to work. Latin services? Gone. Church decorations? Smash them. Mass? Rewritten. And most importantly, they introduce a brand new book that will become the backbone of Anglican worship, the Book of Common Prayer, which is essentially a manual that says, "All right, everyone, this is how English Christianity works now." For the first time ever, church services are conducted in English instead of Latin, which is great news for normal people who previously attended church the way most of us attend airport announcements. You're hearing words, but spiritually you're like, yeah, I have no idea what's happening. So Protestant reforms start spreading across England. Statues disappear. Church walls are whitewashed. Priests start marrying. And England is slowly turning into a proper Protestant country. Except God, or history, apparently decides this experiment has gone on long enough, because Edward suddenly dies at age 15. Which means England once again spins the religious roulette wheel. And this time, the next ruler is someone with a very different personality. Meet Mary I. Mary is Henry VIII's daughter. And remember earlier when Henry divorced her mother, Catherine of Aragon? Yeah. Mary never forgot that. Mary is fiercely Catholic. And when she becomes queen, she basically walks into the throne room like someone who has just discovered the last decade was a massive group project done incorrectly. Her solution? Undo everything. Protestant reforms? Gone. Papal authority? Restored. Churches? Back to Catholic practice. And because the 1500s were, let's say, less chill about religious disagreements than we are today, Mary begins persecuting Protestant leaders, a lot of them. Hundreds of executions later, she earns the nickname Bloody Mary, which, if you've ever ordered the cocktail, is probably not the historical association the bartender intended. So within about 20 years, England has gone through Catholic to Protestant to Catholic again. Imagine if your country switched religions every election cycle. You'd show up to church like, "All right, lads, what are we believing this week?" But the final piece of the puzzle arrives with the next ruler, Henry VIII's other daughter, Elizabeth I. Now Elizabeth grew up watching this entire circus unfold. Her father breaks from Rome. Her brother goes full Protestant. Her sister tries to reverse the whole thing with fire. So when Elizabeth becomes queen, she looks at England and basically says, "Okay, everyone calm down." Because by this point, the country is exhausted. Religious riots, political instability, executions. Nobody agrees on anything. So Elizabeth tries something surprisingly clever. Instead of forcing everyone into one extreme, she builds a compromise church. The Church of England stays independent from Rome, but it keeps many traditional elements people were used to: bishops, liturgy, structured worship. At the same time, the theology leans toward Protestant ideas, like the authority of Scripture. This becomes known as the Elizabethan settlement, and it creates something genuinely unique in Christian history, a church that sits somewhere between Catholicism and Protestantism. Historians later call this idea the via media, Latin for the middle way, which is basically Elizabeth's attempt to say, look, can we all just meet halfway and stop burning each other? And somehow, it works, more or less. The Church of England stabilizes, the religious chaos settles down, and Anglicanism spreads far beyond England through the British Empire. Today, tens of millions of Christians belong to Anglican churches around the world, all because of a chain reaction that began with one king's marital crisis. Think about that for a moment. One royal divorce request turned into a national church, which turned into a global Christian tradition. History is weird like that.